Hello, my name is Catherine Poggi, and I am speaking to you today from the PaTTAN Pittsburgh office, and it is my pleasure to speak with you regarding positive behavior support plans and their in-kind connection to functional-based assessment. During the course of today's discussion, we're going to talk about data tools and efficacy practices that I am hopeful that you can layer into your home base and the present setting that you're operating within. As with any PaTTAN training, we always begin all training events with a review of our PaTTAN mission, and it is as follows. The mission of the PaTTAN and Training Technical Assistant Network is always to ensure that we are working to build up and grow local capacity within our current catchments. And those include all of the local educational agencies and the intermediate units and the different entities that are serving students with special education services. In addition, we always ensure that we speak to the least restrictive environment. And with that, our goal is always to ensure that the Individualized Education Program begins with the general education setting in mind. In working through those details, we are always considering the Supplementary Aids and Services before any more restrictive considerations are thought. For today, we have a couple of objectives that we'll be working through, and they are as follows. Number one, I'm hopeful that we can talk through positive behavior support plans, and I'm going to work to make the necessary links out to functional-based assessments. In addition, we're going to spend a considerable amount of time talking through function-based interventions, because when we're working through behaviors and looking at function-based interventions, we want to make sure that our intervention truly meets the need. And with that, you're able to successfully remove out the subjectivity of interventions, and you can truly rely on data to determine if our interventions are addressing the need at hand. And lastly, before we wrap up today, we're going to talk about some efficacy checks and some details that you as the adult team can work through at your home site. And with that, ensuring that the interventions are being rolled out consistently and that the time is protected, that everyone is understanding the interventions, and that the details are able to be tracked in a methodical way that you can see is the true function being addressed, and are we able to affect the behavioral change that we are seeking. So to get started today, when we think about positive behavior support plans, it's always critical that we first start from the lens of a functional-based assessment. And with that, we need to make sure when we're doing a functional-based assessment, we're coming at it from the lens that we want to see the target behavior. And with that, we need to drill into one target behavior. What is the true behavior of concern? And with that, what is it that we believe is actually the target and the function behind that target that might be disrupting our instructional flow? We do that by really looking at, is the behavior that we're considering observable and measurable? Is the behavior of concern something that one person in your classroom context can look at and define and measure, and they can also iterate that to another person and that they can seek agreement? When we talk about behaviors, we talk about it with a degree of precision. And we want to make sure that we're always exploring antecedents, which essentially means the behavior or the event that happened right before the behavior of concern, and then also consequences, which is the behavior or the event or the activity that happens immediately after the behavior of the concern. The reason why we focus in on those two elements is because those two elements are able to be effectively manipulated and altered in ways that can augment and assist the behavior of change, the behavior that we're trying to target, and the behavior that we're trying to improve. Meaning, if I can manipulate what happens right before a behavior of concern, and I can manipulate what happens right after, my likelihood of changing the behavior of concern into a positive outcome is considerably increased. And when we do that, we are always looking at it from the mind's eye of a setting event. So what are the course of events, or sometimes called the triggers, that might be happening right before a behavior of concern that is probably causing it to be more likely, and it is causing it to be more visible and more present within a pattern. So when we think about FBAs and we think about the patterns that are connected to that, we have to think about, well, what are we analyzing? When we drill into data, We're looking at analyzed patterns, patterns that are predictable, patterns that are common, and patterns that we can intervene on to change the instructional setting to set our students up for success. Several of the data pieces that we zero in on are often called the 5 WHs, where we think about the who's, the what's, the where's, and the why's. What is going on within an instructional setting? And what is the data point that I can glean from that? So to break it down, when is when we're typically looking at allocations of time. When is the behavior most likely to happen? Is it at dismissal? Is it at arrival? Is it during unstructured intervals during the day? Where is pertaining to a location. So when I'm thinking about data and I'm thinking about an intervention that I want to address through a positive behavior support plan, I have to think about, are behaviors more of a concern within a classroom context, within the library, within the restroom? Where is that location that is more prominent? The what is exactly what you're exploring when you're trying to determine the function. The what is the behavior of concern, and it is the item that we are observing. The who is pertaining to the people that are involved. So obviously, we're looking at a focused student. There is a student that is demonstrating a behavior that we're hoping to improve. But also, are there other peers that are also with them during this context? Are there peers that perhaps when things are becoming escalated, that it's a predictable pattern? How can we drill into those patterns and just those social nuances? And the why is the ever important function. Why is the student doing this behavior? When we look at behavior from a pure form, we very much often think about applied behavior analysis. And what we find is all behavior and the related function boil down to essentially two nuances. Our students typically do things to either gain access to items or to avoid items. So the why is usually situated between those two paradigms. In addition, I had mentioned in the earlier slide, we're constantly looking at the consequence scenarios. What is typically happening after a behavioral episode that is probably maintaining a consequence that is allowing that behavior to continue? Is the student being reinforced because they were able to get what they wanted? So they were able to maybe access social attention. Maybe the teacher attended to them if they became visibly upset, or social peer attention. Or were they able to access items? Maybe they got extra help. Or sometimes on the flip side, it could be that they were able to avoid something. There was something that they were trying to get away from. So maybe a disruption, maybe a behavioral tantrum allowed them to actually escape a task that was being presented. So we have to pay very close attention to the consequence condition. And then with that, we have to always keep in our mind's eye, behavior is contextual, behavior is situational. So what broader issues might be influencing behavior? So with that, are we thinking about sensory scenarios? Are we thinking about how they are doing within their ability to attend? What other nuances might be interrupting their participation? In completing an FBA, we have to make sure that we're working through a predictable pattern. FBAs are seriously and concisely a set of steps that are done purposefully to produce an explanation of a response, a precision statement, or sometimes called a hypothesis of why a behavior is happening. So an example for that, when we think about it, would be when this occurs. So for an example, when a student's instructional day is interrupted, maybe they have a weather delay. So the day is now starting at 11 a.m. instead of 9 a.m. The student often has a behavioral episode. So with that, they may have a verbal tantrum. They may refuse to participate, verbally refuse to participate in an activity. And they may do that to avoid being presented with tasks that are unfamiliar or that don't fit the typical daily routine. To make it a little bit more applicable, we could say we have an altered schedule due to a weather event. The student is verbally upset and verbally refusing to now go to the library instead of the computer lab because of that altered event. And they are doing that to gain access back to the computer lab. They're hoping that the behavioral outburst or the behavioral excess could be reinforced by going back to the computer lab, even though we're on an altered schedule. Basically, when you're looking at this screen and the three descriptors that I gave you spell out that ABC continuum: antecedents, behaviors, and consequences. To break it down a little bit further, let's look at this slide. If you could envision, the first block is the antecedent. With that was the presentation of the direction. Today we're operating on a different schedule. Or if you're working with a student that maybe has a content area that is less preferred, today we're going to work through this set of activities. That could be the antecedent that triggers the verbal outburst, the verbal refusal to participate. The middle square is the problem behavior. That's the observable component that we are working to be able to ensure that we have data and observable and measurable components that we can track. The maintaining consequence is the third block. That would be where we talk about the C component. And with that depends on if the student's behavior was reinforced or not reinforced. Were they able to gain access to the preferred activities? So were they able to go to the computer lab, or were they able to escape an activity? Was their verbal refusal, their verbal tantrum reinforced by avoidance? They were allowed to perhaps not transition to the less preferred task. Those are the nuances that we purposefully explore through the course of an FBA. When we think about an FBA and we think about why it is so important in the process, we basically have these 4 bullet points. And with that, as indicated, it is the process to identify the problem behavior. And also, once that's identified and we have a true understanding of the predictable reason, a true function, we are then able to layer in function-based interventions. There is a direct correspondence between the function of the behavior and, within a positive behavior support plan, the functionally equivalent intervention that we layer in. When we work through the steps of the development of the positive behavior support plan, we're looking at environmental antecedents and consequences that maintain those behaviors of concern. So with that, how are those two components working together? The antecedent that happens right before the behavior of concern and the consequences that happen right after. With that, we are able to make informed decisions about how we can structure our environment, how we can set the occasion for our students to be successful, and in doing so, how we can train the adult staff and seek agreement with the adult staff around the activities that we will be working on, the strategies that we will be layering in, and the interventions that we will be consistently doing. All of these decisions are data-based, and all of them are tracked through data-related progress monitoring. Again, the connections to applied behavior analysis are truly evident and very strong. When we think about behavior as a review, again, we have to make sure that we're all working from the same premise, that antecedent is the behavior that happens right before, or the event that happens right before the behavior of concern. Behavior is the actual item that we are exploring, examining to try to determine that function. And consequence is that maintaining event. And consequence has two properties. It can be either reinforcing, which means that it's strengthening the response and raising the occasion that we will see it again. Or punishment, it is actually reducing. It is actually having a negative effect that we will see lesser amounts of that behavior in the future. When we think about the ABC connection, we have to make sure that we're thinking through all components of a student's behavioral repertoire. We have to make sure that we're understanding that these nuances are not only what we're seeing right now within our present learning context, but also the data components that go into that historical repertoire, which means when you conduct a functional-based assessment, there are many nuances and data tools that we want to encourage you to call upon. A true functional-based assessment is something that is worked through over multiple weeks with at least 10 days of true data collection and actual observation. And when we're conducting those observations, we're working with the student across multiple settings, across multiple items and activities and people, because we really want to get a distinct idea as to what may be serving as a trigger. Further, we need to make sure that we're looking at what is going on within the settings that the student is most appropriate. And how can we create those nuances that we can augment their success in future settings? We want to create the occasion of what is really working for that student and generalize that across other appropriate settings. An important distinction to remember is that an FBA and a positive behavior support plan are never completed in the intent to secure a diagnosis. What we are doing is securing the behavioral supports and securing the interventions to be rolled out to best support our learners. That is the nuance that is in our mind's eye. And with that, when we're working through the steps of creating effective function-based interventions, we're also making sure that we're looking at treatment selections and treatment modalities that can be rolled out with efficacy, and that the adult staff are working through those nuances together. Many times, function-based assessments tend to generate that positive behavior support plan, which operates as the roadmap for the adult staff to make sure that the interventions are correct and appropriate for our learners. An important distinction to remember is that the functional-based assessment always happens before the positive behavior support plan. Those two items cannot be reversed. A positive behavior support plan cannot be completed or finalized without the completion of a full functional-based assessment. When we think about function-based interventions, we essentially have this graphic that we can keep in our mind's eye. And again, this allows us to look through the relationship of antecedents, behaviors, and consequences. And when we truly understand a problem behavior and the function or the reason why that problem behavior is occurring, we then can step back and we can look at social appropriateness and the alternatives that we can put in place for a socially appropriate intervention that is functionally equivalent to the problem behavior. So if a student was having a physical outburst or physical aggressions because there was an activity that was not preferred or they felt it was difficult, instead of allowing the dangerous socially inappropriate behaviors to happen, through the course of a positive behavior support plan, we were able to effectively teach a student how to, one, ask for help, which is a socially appropriate alternative, two, ask for a break, which would be governed under the guidelines and the distinctions of a break. So it couldn't be viewed as an escape, but they are using it within its social appropriate intention. Or three, we can equip our learners with the ability that they can access help. So with that, what resources are there that can help them work through those tasks? All of those three considerations and examples are all functionally equivalent to a problem behavior that has been identified through the course of an FBA. When you're conducting an FBA, we have to think about the why. What is the reason behind doing this activity and dedicating the resources to it? Well, they essentially allow us to raise the occasion for success. They allow us to protect our instructional time and to augment the success that is needed to have that environment best support our learners. So we're looking into what is going on with the function of behavior, why is it happening, and how can I manipulate the environment to make sure that perhaps announced changes are in place, routines are predictable, we have pre-taught the behavioral expectations, and we have rich socially appropriate reinforcement in place to help maintain and sustain the behavior that we're trying to see. In addition, when we're working through an FBA, we need to make sure that we're looking at function-based interventions. So the interventions that have been identified are able to be worked through that truly have a functional equivalent. And lastly, we are able to successfully manipulate the antecedents and the consequences that are associated with the problem behavior. Therefore, I can know with predictability and precision if one thing happens at the antecedent stage, I know that this behavior is likely to happen within the behavior stage. So I can try to get ahead of that continuum, and I can know that we can layer in announced changes or predictabilities or even promised reinforcers that raise the occasion for student success. Reasons why an FBA must be conducted. These are things that we've got depicted on this slide. The reasons being is an FBA is associated with a student's IEP. And when a student is in need of working through these steps, it is usually because a student's behavior is interfering with his or her learning or that of his learners or her learners, so the neighboring peers. In addition, FBAs are often conducted if a greater need for data has been determined. If what we have presently in place is still not with precision telling us the function or the reason for the response, there may be a need that we need to work through again the FBA process. Another reason why we commonly see FBAs being conducted is when a student demonstrates a behavioral violation or they violate a code of conduct. And with that, that is not something that is connected to their disability, and it is not something that is connected to a manifestation. So those are two nuances that often trigger the beginning of an FBA phase. And as indicated earlier, the FBA is the first step in developing then the positive behavior support plan. When you're thinking about working through these nuances, it is always critical that you secure parent-family consent. With that, you have to have in your mind's eye, an FBA is something that is conducted for an individual student. An FBA is not something that is being done for all buildings or all children within the building, or all students within the classroom. An FBA is specific to that unique student. Therefore, interventions are being designed and rolled out for that unique student. Therefore, you must ensure that you've secured parent and family consent. In doing so, you need to also make sure that you're working through your local level legislation decisions that are connected to consent. If you have questions regarding that, always make sure that you're looking within your local LEA and also within the bureau contact that is within your catchment. In conducting an FBA, all of these activities connect to our Chapter 14 regulations. And with that, there is commonly a decision tree or a process of activities that play out. When you go into the FBA process, as indicated, your entire intent is to determine why a behavior is happening. What is going on that is depicting why the student is doing that behavior? If you are able to identify the reason and identify the function, you usually then can move into the planning stage and the developmental phase of writing the positive behavior support plan. If there is a degree of uncertainty, or if you're not sure if we truly with precision can predict the function of the behavior, it is common that the FBA protocol and that process needs to be extended. And in doing so, you may need increased days, increased data sources, and increased observations to collect the necessary data to ensure that we are working from a function-based lens. That then would inform the interventions that you play out and that you put in place for your positive behavior support plan. It is critical to realize that throughout this progress and throughout this step, we are progress monitoring and we are relying on data. It is critical that we monitor and we modify as needed. What are the requirements in conducting a positive behavior support plan? Well, it is very critical that a positive behavior support plan is rooted and based truly on your functional-based assessment, and that all interventions and supports are utilized from a strength-based, positive-based lens. In addition, we need to make sure that any interventions that are considered or rolled out are done so within a least restrictive, least intrusive manner. Further, we must ensure that positive behavior support plans are linked solely back to the IEP team. So it is a team-based process. There is not just one person that is completing the positive behavior support plan in the FBA. We have reached consensus. And when we're doing that, we're working as a group and we're delivering the interventions as a group. And there's a consistency component. To do this with efficacy, LEAs need to ensure that they protect time, not only for the understanding and the progress monitoring and the data of the youth and the student that is involved with the intervention, but also to ensure that efficacy is in place and that the intervention is being rolled out consistently across all parties. So you are essentially training up your adult staff to deliver the intervention as intended, and that everyone is doing it with the agreed upon intent. Often we have to also think about what is our criteria of performance. So when we're looking at a positive behavior support plan, again, looking at the data, pre-implementation, what do we have at baseline, our data component there, and what are we intending to have as far as a mastery criteria? These are all nuances within the positive behavior support plan that need to be worked out, and teaming is the backbone for that. What are the requirements for positive behavior support plan? Well, as indicated, the requirements call upon us to ensure that we're using positive techniques, which is a continuum of reinforcements. As indicated, we're working from a strength-based lens, so we want to make sure we have differentiated reinforcement and strength-based protocols that we can put into place, and those do directly connect back to applied behavior analysis. We also need to ensure that we have detailed steps as far as a continuum if a problem behavior continues, and what steps need to be taken if perhaps a restrictive or more of a hand over hand or more of a restraint consideration needs to come into play. Those nuances need to always be later on within the plan, more of a last resort, but we need to make sure that we have a mind's eye and we're looking at every option or detail that may pop up. Many a time, restraint use and the details that are connected to the more restrictive de-escalations and protocols are what are captured within a crisis plan within the positive behavior support plan. It is critical that teams realize this, that it is a crisis plan notion, and it is not something that they jump to right at the beginning of a heightened event. We have an entire continuum of responses that are spelled out. We also need to be mindful that in any event, when a student is in need of a restraint or a physical redirection of a restraint, that the FBA and the positive behavior support plan need to continually be revisited. Have we truly identified the function? And have we layered in the correct objectives and interventions that are needed to best support? Again, a little bit more about the requirements. It is critical that each team is protecting time. So with that, the schools have the primary responsibility to ensure that all parties are understanding and comprehensively carrying out the positive behavior support plan. And that includes the training of all personnel and the methods and techniques. With that, that also includes the data tracking, data analysis, and how we're going to progress monitor the efficacy of the interventions. Number two is also relating to the written policies that are connected to the parental consents. So again, we're looking at it from a teaming lens. We are all well informed of what the function is. We are well informed of the interventions that will be targeted. We are well informed of the continuum of interventions that will be used to support the students. And we also understand if and when a physical management or an intrusive procedure is needed, these are the triggering events that have been already used before a team moves into that level of redirection. There are some important points to remember that all teams need to consider as they work through an FBA process. And with that, we have them captured on this slide. Number one, the functional-based assessment and positive behavior support plan is a living document. It is ongoing, and they are working at an ongoing progress monitoring lens. Two, once a positive behavior support plan is completed, a team cannot assume that that is a once and done. The function of behaviors always need to be monitored, and there are times that they need to go in and they need to modify. Those need to operate under the same nuances and pretenses of the consents and the decision tree that we talked through earlier in this discussion. Also, we need to make sure that we are considering when it is most appropriate to layer in an intervention. So as indicated at the beginning of today's discussion, making sure that we're paying just as much attention to when our students are most appropriate and when they're demonstrating the socially appropriate responses as to when the students are being disruptive and when we're trying to work through a targeted behavior. The more that we can work as a consistent, unified team to create those scenarios where our students are most appropriate, the more likely we will be able to generalize those responses. Lastly, it is critical that we're always looking at positive behavior support plans from a team-based process. So ensuring that you're protecting time to sit down and talk about it as a data team. And the recommendation is at least monthly. We are sitting down purposefully looking at this particular focus student. We're looking at the data and the tracking of the intervention that is in place. And we're deciding if it is appropriate in the continuation or if we can begin to explore a fade plan. There are a few resources that are situated within the PaTTAN system. One is the annotated positive behavior support plan, and the second is the functional based assessment FBA workbook. Both of these documents can be found on our PaTTAN website, which is www.pattan.net, underneath the Publication Resource tab. Lastly, I encourage anyone listening to this webinar to please ensure that you can reach out to your local regional PaTTAN office. We have PaTTAN Pittsburgh, PaTTAN Harrisburg, and PaTTAN Malvern that are situated to help further direct any of your questions and to best support you within this valuable topic. Lastly, again, my name is Catherine Poggi, and I sincerely thank you for your time today, and we hope this content is helpful.